friends, and welcome back. My name is Elizabeth, and today we are talking about character description. How to write it, when to write it, and how not to write it, with examples. So, my first tip for writing effective character description is to utilize character viewpoint. Adeline sits on a bench beside her father. Her father, who is, to her, a mystery, a solemn giant most at home inside his workshop. In this example from The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, the description of Addie's father is so brief. It's barely a line, and the primary descriptive detail is not even a concrete word. It's an abstract word, just the adjective mystery. And usually we're always telling writers to just stay away from abstract adjectives in description because there's nothing concrete for the brain to hold on to, and it just becomes muddy and non-memorable. But in this description, it works, because we know we are in the perspective of this man's daughter, so hearing him described as a mystery is slightly jarring, especially because we can also detect Addie's excitement in these lines, in this opening paragraph. So he's an intriguing mystery and not a fearful one, and we want to know more. How did their relationship get this way? And the beauty of this perspective in character description is that it not only describes the two characters' relationship now in the present, but it also creates intrigue and leaves the door open for further exploration of their relationship going forward. Character perspective, you can't underutilize it really in the character description. You can't overutilize it? That's what I was trying to say. You can underutilize it. Tip number 2, focus on unique features. Stuart Land is a fussy little man whose vested suits with their pinstripes and broad lapels might be described as gangsta-like, except that he is white and crew-cut and somewhere north of 60. His face is round and utterly without affect. His eyes are pale gray and glittering with fierce intelligence. And the half-glasses always perched on his nose make him look more censorious than professional. His prim mouth is always ready with a word of sharp, witty disapproval. Nobody takes to him on first meeting, or second, but somewhere along the way, a certain charisma emerges. And few of our students, even those on the left, manage to leave the law school without sharing in that general warm glow that everybody feels toward him. In this description from The Emperor of Ocean Park by Stephen L. Carter, we get a highly detailed description that starts out focusing on unique nouns like vested suits, pinstripes, and crew cut, and then we slowly lean into the more abstract adjectives like glittering with fierce intelligence, censorious, and professional. Conflicting adjectives are always going to be more interesting than just plainly spouting out adjectives, because it highlights a disparity in this man's description that intrigues us, the reader. It makes the description memorable. This description also makes subtle use of humor by subverting our expectations from the start of the description to the end. Which brings me to tip number 3. Utilize humor. He was a heavy-set man with droopy eyes and a similarly droopy demeanor, whose mouth seemed permanently slumped in a frown. Yet as he moved through the building, his eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. We'll start in the main wings, then traipse over to the Duke Humphreys. Follow along, feel free to have a look. Books are meant to be touched, otherwise they're useless, so don't be nervous. We're quite proud of our last few major acquisitions. There's the Richard Gough map collection, donated in 1809. The British Museum didn't want them, can you believe it? And then the Malone donation 10 or so years ago. It greatly expanded our Shakespearean materials. Oh, and just 2 years ago we received the Francis Douce collection. That's 13,000 volumes in French and English. Though I suppose neither of you is specializing in French. Arabic? Oh yes, right this way. The Institute has the bulk of Arabic materials at Oxford, but I've got some poetry volumes from Egypt and Syria that may interest you. In this description of a professor in Babel by R.F. Kuang, we initially get another brief line of description. It's not detailed, but it does repeat its most unique word, droopy. In writing, repetition is always a good way to highlight a humorous line since it draws attention to itself. This is also the first description we've seen where dialogue is used as part of character description. In fact, in this description, dialogue is used as much, if not more, than the general narrative surrounding the dialogue. Using dialogue as character description can be one of the hardest ways to effectively describe characters. It's something that I try to do sparingly in my own writing, because if done poorly, it becomes extremely obvious and off-putting. But, on the other hand, dialogue as description is one of my all-time favorite ways to read character description in books. So if you can master it, it is worth it, because it really brings your characters to life more than static description really ever can. Also, I tend to find that in books with a large cast of characters, or like in mysteries with lots of suspects as characters, using dialogue to enhance your description is really the best way to go, since it allows the reader to really separate each character from each other, and also remember which character is which. Something to keep in mind. It's hard to do, but worth it if you can do it good. Tip number 4. Utilize the world of the story. Fro Diller was a sharp-edged woman with fat glasses and a nefarious glare. She developed this evil look to discourage the very idea of stealing from her shop, which she occupied with soldier-like posture, a refrigerated voice, and even breath that smelled like Heil Hitler. The shop itself was white and cold and completely bloodless. The small house compressed beside it shivered with a little more severity than the other buildings on Himmel Street. Frau Diller administered this feeling, dishing it out as only free item from her premises. She lived for her shop, and her shop lived for the Third Reich. In this description from The Book Thief by Markus Zusak, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce it. We get a description that could really only happen in the world of this story, which is Nazi-occupied Germany during World War II. We get words like soldier-like, and a character described as having a refrigerated voice, and breath that smells like Heil Hitler. That is an absolutely chilling descriptor for any character, really, but it only works here because we know the setting. That type of description in any other setting, like a contemporary romance or a high fantasy world, would be extremely offensive and crass, and completely out of place. It wouldn't be memorable. It would just be off-putting. But within the world of this story, it's extremely effective, because the description is utilizing the world. Tip number 5, utilize comparison. Before our example, comparison is often a good way to describe the main character without being too overt about it. You have them compare themselves to another character, or the narrator compares them to some other character, physically or emotionally. You're describing the character by ranking them against other characters and utilizing point of view. Comparison usually goes hand in hand with character viewpoint, but in the example I'm going to show you, From One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus, this character description isn't actually comparing two different characters, but instead is comparing a single character to a memory of that same character in the past. Different use of comparison. Cooper pushes the front door open, and there, thank God, is Jake. I collapse into his arms, and for a second everything's okay. I'll never forget seeing Jake for the first time, freshman year. He had a mouthful of braces and hadn't gotten tall or broad-shouldered yet, but I took one look at his dimples and summer sky blue eyes and knew he was the one for me. It's just a bonus that he turned out beautiful. This is still an effective, memorable way to use comparison in a way that's interesting and not too straightforward, which leads me to tip number 6, which is, the straightforward description. People often avoid it, people often say to avoid it, but I would be remiss if I didn't include a successful example of straight-to-the-point description. Because you see it all the time in books, in popular books, in successful literary novels. Usually me and everyone else will tell you not to write plain, listicle style descriptions that rely on to-be adverbs followed by bullet-pointed adjectives in order to describe anything in your novel. There is no life in that kind of description. But people still do it all the time very successfully, and we should look at it to learn why, How can that go against all of the major advice and still work? So, in Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, we get this type of description of the primary character. And I think it's important to look at because it works. Somehow it works. These books are very successful. So, why does it work here? That is the question. So here we go. Although not overly handsome in a classical sense, the 40-year-old Langdon had what his female colleagues referred to as an erudite appeal. Wisps of gray in his thick brown hair, probing blue eyes, and an arrestingly deep voice, and the strong, carefree smile of a collegiate athlete. A varsity diver in prep school and college, Langdon still had the body of a swimmer, a toned, 6-foot physique that he vigilantly maintained, with 50 laps a day in the university pool. Langdon's friends had always viewed him as a bit of an enigma, a man caught between centuries. On weekends, he could be seen lounging on the quad in blue jeans, discussing computer graphics or religious history with students. Other times he could be spotted in his Harris tweed and paisley vest, photographed in the pages of upscale art magazines at museum openings, where he had been asked to lecture. Although a tough teacher and strict disciplinarian, Langdon was the first to embrace what he hailed as the lost art of good, clean fun. He relished recreation with an infectious fanaticism that had earned him a fraternal acceptance among his students. His campus nickname, the Dolphin, was a reference both to his affable nature and his legendary ability to dive into a pool and outmaneuver the entire opposing squad in a water polo match. Not only does this description make heavy use of adjectives in a standard, listicle way, but it also relies heavily on cliches and self-insert fantasy. And that could be the reason why it works here. Whenever I use Dan Brown as an example in these videos, I always upset people who are like, Dan Brown is not a good writer. We should not look to him as an example. But, You know, that could be true, except Dan Brown is one of, if not the best-selling author of all time. And I do think there's value in breaking down his books to figure out why that is. You know, what combination of self-insert fantasy, familiar plot points, over-the-top pacing, and manipulation of real-world places, events, and belief systems have given rise to these mega book sales. You know, you could write a book with any one of these elements and not come close to the level of success that these books have seen. So there's got to be some secret, learnable magic in the writing, you know, that these books hold, that we could learn from and improve our own commercial writing abilities. If, and it's a big if, commercial writing success is your goal. If your aim is more literary, or to have more emotional, complex, dynamic characters, then you might not have much to learn from Dan Brown's books. But that's not everyone's goal. That's not every book's goal. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, sometimes people like to read fast-paced escapist thrillers without much emotional depth to the characters. It's fun. And reading can be fun, you know, I enjoy books like that. I like Dan Brown. I don't only enjoy books like that, but I do sometimes enjoy them. There's nothing wrong with that. And maybe I'd want to write a book like that. And these are the types of books I would study to learn how to write a book like that. I just feel like if you want to write a book like that, commercially successful book, learning from very successful, commercially successful books, it's a good place to start, you know? Just giving you options. Please like and subscribe.